Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads. Glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. On the morning the clock softened, steam from Maple's kettle rose in slow, patient lines, as if even vapor had learned to breathe more gently. The kitchen window stood slightly open, letting in a shore breeze that carried salt and something sweeter, the scent of possibility trying to remember its name. Maple moved the kettle to the back burner and set her weathered palm against the faded wood of the table, listening to the house settle around them. She had lived long enough to know the difference between silence and gentleness, and this morning felt wrapped in the latter. The kind that welcomes you without asking for anything in return. May gripped that same wooden table as the contractions found their rhythm, her breathing synchronizing with the kettle's patient song and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. The midwife, Clara, kept glancing at that clock with a puzzled expression. The hands moved forward as they should, but somehow the tick-tock had softened into something more like a lullaby, each second falling as gently as snow on still water. She'd been delivering babies for 30 years and had never heard time sound quite so patient, as if the morning itself was holding its breath to welcome this particular child. When River finally arrived, slipping into the world as easily as morning light slides across floorboards, their first cry was barely a whisper. Clara had expected the sharp wail that announces a baby's entrance, the demanding sound that says, "I am here and I need everything right now." Instead, River opened their tiny mouth and released something that made everyone in the room pause and listen, a sound so soft it seemed to wrap around them like the quilt Maple had been stitching for months, the one that smelled of lavender sachets and half-remembered lullabies. Maple took the baby from Clara's hands with the reverence she reserved for her grandmother's china, pieces that held the memory of Sunday dinners and birthday celebrations. River's eyes, wide and dark as tide pools, seemed to take in the kitchen with ancient recognition, as if they had been here before in dreams or in the space between sleeping and waking. The old woman felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the way certain souls find each other across time. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Great Quieting of the Clocks. On the mantelpiece, the grandfather clock that had run fast for decades suddenly began keeping perfect time, but with a gentler tick. The washing machine in the basement, known for its violent spin cycle that rattled the foundation, completed its load with barely a whisper. Even the old pipes that usually clanged and complained seemed to have found their manners, carrying water through the walls as quietly as rivers through meadows. Outside the kitchen window, the neighbor's rooster forgot to crow with his usual urgency, and instead offered something that sounded almost like a question, soft and wondering. The delivery truck rumbling down Harbor Street seemed to downshift into a quieter gear, its engine humming rather than roaring, as it passed the little house with lavender shutters. Mrs. Henderson's usually yappy terrier was napping peacefully on her front porch, and even the teenagers at the corner store had somehow found a volume that felt like conversation rather than announcement. As River slept that first afternoon in the bassinet Maple had used for her own children, their breathing created the softest rhythm, barely audible but somehow present in the room like the memory of a lullaby. May found herself sitting beside the crib, watching the gentle rise and fall of her baby's chest, listening to the world outside respond in kind. The leaves on the old oak rustled with a softer whisper. The waves on the nearby shore receded with a more patient sigh. Sam arrived home from his shift at the harbor to find the entire neighborhood settled into an unusual quiet. The fishing boats returning to dock cut their engines earlier than usual, drifting the last 100 yards as if they didn't want to disturb whatever gentle spell had settled over the town, like morning mist. That first night, River slept with a small smile, tiny fists unclenched, looking for all the world like someone who had arrived exactly where they belonged. May woke several times, not because River was crying, but because the silence felt so profound, she had to check that everything was all right. Each time she found the baby dreaming peacefully, and as she stood there in the soft darkness, she could swear she heard it. The gentlest humming, not quite a song but something deeper, a rhythm that seemed to invite the whole world to rest a little easier, to breathe a little deeper, to remember that some things in life were worth slowing down for. By the time River turned 3, the gentle phenomenon that had begun with their birth had settled into the rhythm of daily life like morning mist that never quite burns away. May moved through her days with a quiet awareness that something extraordinary lived in the ordinary moments, the way River's soft humming could transform the washing machine's agitated cycle into something that sounded almost like contentment, or how the grandfather clock in the hallway had maintained its patient, heartbeat rhythm since that first morning when time itself had learned to breathe more gently. River's first clear word wasn't mama or dada, but a sound that lived somewhere between humming and whispering, a gentle that seemed to acknowledge the world with tender curiosity rather than demand its attention. They would sit in their high chair during breakfast, making this soft sound while watching dust motes dance in the morning light, and May noticed that even those tiny specks seemed to swirl in more graceful patterns, like miniature galaxies finding their orbit around River's quiet presence. The true nature of River's gift revealed itself gradually, the way understanding often comes, not in dramatic moments but in the accumulation of small wonders that eventually become impossible to ignore. Mrs. Chen next door had been walking the floors for weeks with her colicky baby, Marcus, whose cries seemed to pierce through walls and dreams alike. May would lie awake listening to her neighbor's exhausted footsteps, the sound of a mother reaching the limits of her strength, while her child raged against some invisible discomfort that no amount of rocking or singing could soothe. One particularly difficult evening, as Marcus's wails reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of both houses, River began to hum from their crib. Not the demanding cry of a child wanting attention, but that same soft, questioning melody they'd been offering to the world since birth, now shaped into something that felt like a gentle hand extended in friendship. The humming was barely audible, more felt than heard, like the vibration of a tuning fork held against your chest. Within minutes, something shifted in the night air. Marcus's sharp cries began to soften at the edges, transforming from desperate wails into something more like conversation, then gradually fading into the kind of tired whimpering that precedes the surrender to sleep. May crept to River's crib and found her child lying peacefully, eyes closed but still humming that tender tune, as if they were singing not just to Marcus but to the darkness itself, helping it remember how to hold rest instead of restlessness. The next morning brought Mrs. Chen to their door, circles under her eyes but wonder in her voice as she described how Marcus had slept for 6 straight hours, the longest stretch since his birth. She spoke of dreams filled with her grandmother's lullabies, songs she hadn't remembered in decades, as if River's humming had unlocked some deep vault of comfort in her memory. May invited her in for coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table while River played quietly with wooden blocks, occasionally humming to themselves in a way that made the morning light seem to gather more warmly around them. As River grew from toddler into child, their gift continued to reveal itself in moments that felt more like grace than magic. When old Mrs. Gable from down the street visited, her arthritic knees causing her to wince with each step, River would climb onto her lap without invitation and simply rest there, humming while Mrs. Gable told stories about her garden. The elderly woman's face would gradually relax, the tight lines of chronic pain smoothing, as if River's gentle vibrations were helping her body remember what comfort felt like. Sam, who had always been a practical man, more comfortable with the concrete realities of boats and nets and weather, found himself watching his child with growing amazement. When his old dog Sailor developed the kind of joint stiffness that made rainy days a misery, River would sit beside him on the porch, humming while stroking his graying muzzle. The dog's restless panting would slow, his constant shifting would cease, and he'd settle into the kind of deep rest that seemed to ease something beyond mere physical discomfort. School brought new opportunities for River's quiet ministry. During afternoon rest time, when the classroom buzzed with the particular energy of 25 children trying to be still, River would lie on their mat and breathe until that restless frequency found a gentler pitch. Their teacher, Miss Pruitt, began to look forward to those moments, finding herself rocking in her chair with her eyes half closed, papers forgotten, as peace settled over the room like a soft blanket. It was during this time that River befriended Luna, the girl from the yellow house at the corner, whose nightmares left her afraid to sleep. They would lie on their backs in the field behind the school, River humming wordlessly to the stars, while Luna gradually learned that silence didn't have to feel empty. It could feel full of companionship instead. River didn't try to chase away Luna's fears with explanations or distractions. They simply offered their presence, creating a space where fear could exist without having to fight for attention. May and Sam never made a fuss about any of it. They taught River to ask permission before offering comfort, to understand that their gift was meant for service, not performance. At supper, they would eat sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, while listening to the radio's gentle murmur. And on certain evenings when the wind turned just right, the lighthouse beam would sweep across their windows like a slow, patient hand, waving from very far away. River would pause with their glass of milk halfway to their mouth, head tilted toward that distant light, as if recognizing something familiar in its steady, faithful rhythm. The lighthouse had been whispering to River for months before they understood what the feeling meant. Every evening when that patient beam swept across their bedroom window, River would pause in their gentle humming and turn toward the light with the kind of recognition that lives deeper than memory. May noticed how River's songs would shift during those moments, taking on a rhythm that seemed to match something beyond the visible world, as if the lighthouse keeper's steady work and River's quiet gift were notes in the same ancient melody. It was Luna who first suggested they visit on a Saturday morning when spring mist hung soft over the harbor like a gray silk scarf. The two 12-year-olds walked the winding path that led up from town, past weathered fence posts and wild roses that somehow thrived despite the salt air. River carried a thermos of May's hot chocolate, the steam rising like small prayers into the cool morning air, while Luna collected smooth pebbles that caught her eye along the way. Cordelia opened the lighthouse door before they could knock, as if she'd been watching for them through the salt-streaked windows that faced the sea. She was a woman whose age seemed less like a number and more like accumulated wisdom, her silver hair braided with the kind of care that spoke of long practice in solitude. Her hands were weathered from years of tending glass and flame, and when she looked at River, something in her pale blue eyes shifted from polite curiosity to quiet recognition. The way you might notice a familiar melody being hummed by a stranger, the lighthouse. Keeper invited them inside with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that important conversations rarely announce themselves with fanfare. The interior felt like stepping inside a nautilus shell, all curved walls and spiraling stairs, with windows that framed the ocean like living paintings that changed with every shift of light and weather. Cordelia moved through the space with fluid efficiency, setting out 3 mismatched cups on a table that bore the gentle scars of countless solitary meals. Over steaming tea that tasted of honey and distant places, Cordelia began to speak about the art of lighthouse keeping. She explained that the light wasn't just about illumination, but about creating a fixed point in a world that was constantly shifting. Ships needed something steady to navigate by, she said, something that would be exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly when it was supposed to be there, regardless of weather or season, or the particular challenges any given night might bring. River listened with the kind of stillness that made Luna think of deep, quiet water, occasionally humming that soft sound that seemed to encourage Cordelia to share stories she might not tell to other visitors. The lighthouse keeper spoke of foggy nights when visibility dropped to nothing, of storms that tested both the light and her resolve to keep it burning, of the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her vigilance had helped travelers find their way safely home. As the afternoon unfolded, Cordelia began showing them the practical work of lighthouse maintenance. She demonstrated how to clean the great Fresnel lens with special cloths that wouldn't scratch the delicate surface, how to check the oil levels and adjust the wick for steady burning. River absorbed each lesson with focused attention, as if they were learning not just techniques, but something deeper about the nature of service itself. When thick fog rolled in from the sea that evening, blanketing the coast in dense, silent grey, Cordelia led them to the lamp room as the foghorn began its slow, mournful call. River stood near the great lens, listening to the deep vibration that seemed to travel through water and mist to reach ships they couldn't see. Almost without thinking, they began to hum, a soft melody that seemed to weave itself into the foghorn's rhythm, not trying to change anything but simply offering companionship to whatever moved unseen in that white silence. Cordelia watched with the kind of attention she usually reserved for reading weather patterns. After the fog lifted and stars appeared like scattered silver coins, she spoke quietly about the difference between guiding and controlling. The lighthouse didn't pull ships to shore, she explained. It simply promised to be there, steady and faithful, so that lost things could remember their way home. River understood then that their gift wasn't about fixing or commanding, but about accompaniment, about being present with whatever needed comfort until it found its own path forward. As they walked back down the winding path toward town, Luna noticed that River's humming had taken on a new quality, something that reminded her of the lighthouse beam itself, patient, constant, and somehow reassuring in a way that made the gathering darkness feel less like an ending and more like a gentle transition into whatever peace the night might bring. Behind them, the lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, sweeping across the water with faithful persistence, and River felt something settle in their chest, like a compass finding true north, pointing toward a future they couldn't yet see but somehow already knew they were meant to. Surf. The months following River's first lessons at the lighthouse brought a deeper understanding that some gifts are meant to grow, alongside the heart that carries them. River's afternoons with Cordelia had taught them about steady presence, about being a fixed point in a shifting world, and as autumn painted the coastal town in shades of amber and rust, they began to sense that their calling was preparing to expand beyond the gentle comforts of childhood into something more profound. Luna had been River's closest companion since those early school days when they'd learned to hum the classroom into peaceful rest. At 16, she moved through the world with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being deeply known and accepted, her laughter carrying across the harbor on evening breezes as she helped her father mend nets and sort the day's catch. Her father was a man whose hands told stories of salt and rope, whose presence filled their small house with the particular warmth that comes from someone who has found his place in the world and settled into it with gratitude. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the light held that golden quality that makes everything look like a memory even as it's happening. Luna appeared at River's door with tears streaming down her face and words that seemed to crack the gentle rhythm of their world. Her father had collapsed at the dock while securing his boat, his heart simply stopping mid-conversation with another fisherman about the weather turning. The ambulance had come with its urgent lights, but there are some journeys that cannot be interrupted once they begin, and Luna's father had already traveled beyond the reach of any earthly intervention. River found themselves sitting on Luna's front porch as evening settled around them like a soft grey shawl, listening to the sounds of a house learning how to hold sudden absence. Inside, neighbors moved with hushed efficiency, bringing casseroles and condolences, their voices carrying the particular gentleness that people discover in the presence of unexpected loss. Luna sat beside River, her sobs coming in waves that seemed to mirror the restless ocean just a few blocks away, and River understood that they were facing something entirely different from the gentle discomforts they'd learned to ease with their humming. This was grief in its raw, immediate form, not something to be soothed or fixed, but something that needed to be witnessed, held companioned through the long dark hours when the world feels fundamentally changed. When River began to hum, it wasn't the soft, questioning melody of their childhood, but something deeper, more like a sustained note that made space for pain rather than trying to diminish it. They weren't attempting to take away Luna's tears, but offering to sit with them, to let sorrow know it wasn't alone in the gathering darkness. Over the following weeks, River learned that their gift could expand to hold more than they had ever imagined. They would sit together in Luna's father's workshop, surrounded by half-finished boat repairs and the lingering scent of tar and wood shavings, while River hummed, and Luna spoke about memories that felt too precious to lose and too painful to hold. River discovered that their humming could create a kind of gentle sanctuary where grief felt safe to express itself fully, where tears didn't need to be hurried along or explained away. The funeral brought the entire town together in the small church by the harbor, and River found themselves naturally moving through the gathering, not seeking attention, but simply being present wherever comfort seemed most needed. Their humming became a kind of background music for shared sorrow, helping people remember that grief carried together somehow weighs less than grief carried alone. It was Luna's aunt, a nurse at the local hospice, who suggested that River might have something to offer the residents there. "They don't need fixing," she said gently. "Just someone to sit with them as they prepare for their own journey. Someone to remind them they're not traveling alone." So River began visiting Sunset Manor, learning that their calling extended to those approaching the threshold between this world and whatever lay beyond. They sat with Captain Murphy, an old fisherman whose weathered hands still moved as if casting nets, even as his body prepared for its final voyage. River's gentle humming seemed to give him permission to speak about his wife, gone these 15 years, and how he sometimes dreamed he could see her waiting on a distant shore. There was Mrs. Chen, who had spent her life caring for others and now struggled with accepting care herself, and young Mr. Torres, barely older than River, whose illness had taught him more about courage than most people learn in a lifetime. River learned to sit with each person's unique way of facing the unknown, offering not answers, but presence, not solutions, but companionship. As winter deepened and the lighthouse beam made its patient rounds through longer nights, River understood that their gift was evolving from childhood comfort to something approaching sacred service. They were learning to sing not just to the living, but to the mystery itself, offering their voice as a bridge between what is known and what remains beautifully, terrifyingly unknown. The quiet wisdom River found in the hospice corridors, sitting with those whose journeys were drawing to their gentle close, had taught them that memory lives in unexpected places, in the rhythm of breathing, in the way fingers move across worn quilts, in melodies that surface from depths the mind can no longer consciously reach. It was during one of these twilight visits, when Captain Murphy hummed a half-remembered sea chanty while watching fog drift past his window, that River began to understand how songs could be bridges between what was and what needed to remain. Spring arrived with unusual gentleness that year, as if the season itself had learned something about patience from the town's transformed rhythm. With it came a stranger, who stepped off the morning bus carrying a guitar case worn smooth by countless miles, and a leather satchel that seemed to hold more stories than belongings. They moved through the harbor market with the unhurried attention of someone accustomed to listening rather than looking, pausing when Mrs. Patterson taught her granddaughter an old work song while sorting the morning's catch. River first noticed Sage standing at a respectful distance from this impromptu lesson, head tilted with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. When the melody ended, Sage approached with gentle curiosity, asking about the song's origins with the care of someone who understood that such questions were invitations to memory rather than mere curiosity. River watched this interaction with growing fascination, recognizing something they had never quite encountered before, someone who seemed to understand that songs were living repositories of the heart's deepest truths. When Sage noticed River's attention and offered a smile, that felt like recognition between old friends. River found themselves walking alongside this traveling collector, drawn by an inexplicable sense that their paths had crossed for reasons neither of them yet understood. Over tea at May's kitchen table, Sage explained their work with the kind of quiet passion that comes from having discovered one's true calling. They traveled from place to place, collecting half-remembered lullabies and work songs, fragments of melodies that grandparents hummed without thinking, verses that had been passed down like precious heirlooms that somehow never made it into official songbooks. May found herself sharing melodies she hadn't thought about in decades, songs her own grandmother had hummed while kneading bread, lullabies that had once soothed River to sleep as a baby. Sage listened with the kind of attention that made simple memories feel suddenly precious, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped May remember additional verses, other family members who had carried the same tunes through their own quiet lives. River began joining Sage on visits throughout the town, learning to recognize the moment when someone's face would soften with recognition, when a half-forgotten melody would surface from the deep wells of memory, like morning mist rising from still water. They visited Mrs. Chen, who sang a haunting lullaby in Mandarin that her own mother had brought across an ocean, and Cordelia at the lighthouse, whose humming seemed to match the patient rhythm of the beacon itself. But it was during their visit to Sunset Manor that something profound began to take shape. As Sage gently coaxed forgotten melodies from residents whose voices had grown thin, but whose memories of music remain surprisingly strong. River found their own humming weaving naturally into these rediscovered songs. Their gift, which had always been about offering comfort in the present moment, suddenly revealed a new dimension, the ability to help preserve and honor the musical memories that connected generations. The idea for what would become known as the Song Library emerged naturally from their shared work. The town's old train station, abandoned since the coastal railway had closed decades earlier, sat at the edge of town like a patient question mark, its waiting room still furnished with wooden benches that had witnessed countless hellos and goodbyes. River, Sage, and Luna spent warm afternoons transforming the space, clearing away years of gentle neglect and polishing surfaces that seemed eager to serve a new purpose. Sage taught River about the delicate art of preservation, how to record voices without losing their essential warmth, how to notate melodies that had never been written down. But more importantly, they explored together the deeper questions about why certain songs survived while others faded. What made some melodies feel like home regardless of who was singing them? As the song library took shape, with transcribed melodies hanging on the walls like visual lullabies and comfortable spaces for sharing and listening, River discovered that their humming had evolved once again. Working alongside Sage, they learned to create an atmosphere where people felt safe to share their most precious musical memories, where half-forgotten songs could emerge from the shadows of time and find new voices to carry them forward. The space became not just an archive, but a living sanctuary where the past breathed gently into the present, ensuring that love, like music, never truly faded, but simply found new ways to resonate across the generations. The Song Library had been open for 3 months when the weather began to change, not with the dramatic fury that coastal towns expected from Atlantic storms, but with something that felt more like the ocean learning to breathe differently. River noticed it first during their evening walks home from the converted train station, when clouds would gather on the horizon with unusual patience, moving across the sky like thoughts taking their time to form into words. These weren't the fierce tempests that had battered the coast for generations, arriving with urgent winds that sent fishing boats scrambling for harbor and shutters slamming against salt-weathered walls. Instead, the new storms approached with deliberate gentleness, bringing rain that fell like whispered conversations and wind that moved through the streets with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. River would stand at their bedroom window, watching these atmospheric changes, feeling something in their chest respond to the weather's transformed rhythm. It was during one such gentle storm that River first sensed their gift expanding beyond the human realm. Walking to the lighthouse to check on Cordelia, they found themselves humming along with the rain's soft percussion against the harbor stones. As their voice joined the evening's natural symphony, something shifted in the air around them, not dramatically, but with the subtle recognition that comes when two old friends discover they've been humming the same melody. The ocean, which had been restless with its usual evening energy, seemed to settle into a deeper rhythm. Waves that had been breaking against the shore with insistent force began to recede with softer sighs, each retreat feeling less like withdrawal and more like the patient exhalation of something vast learning to rest. River stood transfixed, understanding that they weren't controlling anything, but simply participating in a conversation that had been waiting for their voice to complete it. Cordelia found them there an hour later, still humming softly, while rain streamed down their face in gentle rivulets. The lighthouse keeper approached with her usual unhurried grace, carrying 2 cups of tea that steamed like small prayers in the transformed evening air. "The sea's been listening," she said simply, handing River a warm mug. "Been waiting for someone who knows how to listen back." Over the following weeks, as these unusual storms became a regular feature of the coastal weather, the townspeople began to notice changes that felt both mysterious and natural. The harbor's perpetually choppy waters would smooth during River's evening walks, allowing fishing nets to slip into the depths without snagging. The old pier, notorious for its loose board that had caught countless shoe soles over the years, somehow stopped being a hazard. Even the bell at the end of the breakwater, which had hung at an awkward angle since a storm 5 years prior, seemed to have straightened itself, its tone brightening as if pleased to be heard clearly again. River discovered that their humming had developed new depths during these atmospheric conversations, harmonies that seemed to contain echoes of wind and water, frequencies that resonated not just in their chest, but in the very air around them. Standing on the lighthouse gallery with Cordelia during another patient tempest, they could hear it clearly, a low, sustained undertone that seemed to emanate from the storm itself, as if the clouds and rain had found their own voice and were offering it in gentle communion. Sage noticed the change immediately during their evening sessions at the song library, commenting that River's voice now carried something that made the small room feel both intimate and infinite, as if it somehow contained the vast sky. When people gathered to share their remembered melodies, River's humming would occasionally pick up these atmospheric harmonies, creating a musical space where individual songs seemed to connect with something much larger than memory. The children in town began falling asleep more easily on stormy nights, and elderly residents reported dreams filled with music. They couldn't quite remember upon waking, but that left them feeling strangely comforted. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her arthritis seemed less troublesome during the gentle storms, while Captain Murphy at Sunset Manor spoke of hearing his wife's voice in the rain, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with the soft recognition of love that transcends physical presence. River understood then that their childhood gift of offering comfort had evolved into something approaching sacred service to the living world itself. As they stood with Cordelia in the lighthouse beam, watching another patient storm approach across waters that seemed to shimmer with anticipation, they felt their voice joining not just the weather's song, but something even deeper, the earth's own lullaby to itself, the ancient melody that had been playing since the first rain fell on the first ocean. The lighthouse beam swept across the transformed seascape with its faithful rhythm, and River sensed that they were part of an ongoing conversation between all living things, one that had been temporarily forgotten, but was now being remembered, one gentle note at a time. Whatever larger transformation was approaching their small coastal town, River felt ready to serve as a bridge between the human need for peace and the world's own deep rhythms of renewal, humming their part in the vast patient symphony that connected sky and sea and heart. The gentle storms that had taught River to harmonize with something larger than themselves seemed to whisper of new possibilities during the quiet hours between weather and rest. As spring settled over the coastal town with its usual patient insistence, River found themselves walking familiar streets with different eyes, noticing not just where comfort had been needed, but where it might be offered more consistently, more accessibly, like a lighthouse that burned not just at night, but through all the daylight hours when people needed guidance most. The old bakery on Harbour Street had stood empty since Mrs. Kowalski closed it 2 winters prior, its windows gathering the particular dust that accumulates in spaces where dreams have been carefully folded and put away. River had often paused outside those windows during evening walks, humming softly to the lingering scent of yeast and flour that seemed to haunt the threshold like a gentle ghost waiting for resurrection. The space held memory in its weathered brick walls and worn wooden floors, the kind of institutional warmth that comes from years of nourishing a community one loaf at a time. It was during one of those contemplative pauses that River understood their calling was evolving again, expanding from individual moments of comfort to something that might serve as a steady anchor in the daily rhythm of the town's life. When Sage suggested that River might create, rather than simply visit spaces of solace, the idea settled into their consciousness, like a seed finding fertile ground, growing quietly as they imagined what it might mean to offer more than momentary presence. Mrs. Kowalski, when approached about renting the space, responded with the particular brightness that comes from seeing something beloved find new purpose. "The ovens still work," she said simply, her weathered hands tracing the familiar surfaces with obvious affection. "They've been waiting for someone who understands that food is just love made visible." River spent weeks preparing the space, not erasing its history, but honoring it, keeping the large wooden table where countless batches of dough had been rolled, preserving the chalkboard menu that still listed prices from another era. The sandwich shop that emerged felt less like a business venture and more like a natural extension of River's gift made manifest in the physical world. They kept offering simple soup that simmered with the patience of someone who understood nourishment came from attention as much as ingredients, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper with small handwritten notes tucked inside that said things like, "You're doing better than you think," or "Tomorrow might surprise you with its gentleness." Elias, the mail carrier whose 39 years of faithful service were drawing to a close, became one of the first regulars. Arriving each morning before his route with shoulders that carried more than letters, they bore the invisible weight of approaching retirement and the fear that usefulness might end with employment. River would prepare his egg salad sandwich with deliberate care, wrapping it alongside a note that might read, "Every path has new turnings," or "The quiet moments hold the most wisdom." Elias never mentioned the notes directly, but River noticed how his step seemed lighter as he continued his rounds, how he'd begun leaving small kindnesses of his own, a wildflower tucked into Mrs. Patterson's mailbox, an extra moment spent helping elderly residents with packages. Miriam, from the library, discovered that River's cucumber sandwiches somehow tasted like the comfort she'd been missing since her children scattered to distant cities with skylines she could only visit through video calls. She would sit at the corner table, reading letters from grandchildren, whose voices she heard more often through speakers than in person, while River's soft humming created an atmosphere where loneliness felt less like isolation and more like a temporary condition that could be gently companioned. Gus, the mechanic whose hands told stories of engines and repair, carried a secret that made him approach the written word with the same careful attention he brought to complex machinery. At 63, he was learning to read, his weathered fingers tracing letters with the concentration of someone discovering that transformation remains possible at any age. River would clear the corner table after the lunch rush, setting out simple books and humming while Gus practiced, creating a cocoon of patience where struggle transformed from embarrassment into the kind of courageous learning that deserved witness and celebration. As word spread through the town's gentle networks of connection, the sandwich shop became known not for its food, but for something harder to name, the way conversations seemed to flow more easily there, the way difficult truths felt safer to speak, the way people left feeling somehow more themselves than when they had arrived. River moved through the small space with the same unhurried grace they had learned from Cordelia at the lighthouse, understanding that their role was not to fix anyone's problems, but to create space where those problems could be held with compassion. The lighthouse beam, making its faithful nightly rounds, seemed to linger for an extra moment over the sandwich shop's warm windows, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in the steady, gentle work of guiding hearts safely through the daily storms that required no wind or rain to challenge the human spirit. The sandwich shop had woven itself into the town's daily rhythm like a familiar melody, its warm windows and patient conversations becoming as natural as the lighthouse beam's nightly sweep. River moved through the small space with practiced grace, wrapping sandwiches in wax paper and tucking encouraging notes into brown bags, but their heart had begun to sense something shifting in the larger symphony of their world, a subtle change in tempo that called for a different kind of attention. It was during one of their regular afternoon visits to the lighthouse that River first noticed Cordelia standing before the great lens with her polishing cloth held. Motionless in her weathered hands, the older woman stared out at the familiar horizon with an expression River had never seen before. Not confusion exactly, but a gentle bewilderment, as if the seascape she had watched for 47 years had somehow rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. "The light needs tending," Cordelia murmured, her voice carrying the same patient cadence it always had, but with something new underneath, a quality like morning mist that makes familiar landmarks seem suddenly distant. "But I seem to have misplaced the sequence. Isn't that strange? My hands remember, but the remembering feels like it's happening underwater." River approached with the same unhurried care they brought to all their encounters with fragility, whether it was Luna's grief or Captain Murphy's final journey. They stood beside Cordelia without urgency, letting their presence offer companionship rather than solutions. When River began to hum, it wasn't the questioning melody of their childhood, but something deeper, more like a sustained note that created space for uncertainty, without trying to fill it with false reassurance. Over the following weeks, a new ritual emerged as naturally as seasons changing. River would arrive each afternoon with a thermos of tea and whatever small comfort the day suggested. Warm scones when fog pressed close, wildflowers when sunshine broke through clouds, smooth pieces of sea glass that caught the light like captured memories. They would sit together in the lamp room, surrounded by the patient gleam of the great lens, and engage in the gentle work of tending not just the lighthouse but the keeper herself. Cordelia's cedar chest held decades of letters from grateful ship captains, their edges soft with salt air and time, each one a testament to the lives her faithful vigil had helped guide safely home. River discovered that these letters could serve as bridges when Cordelia's memory wandered into fog. They would read aloud in the same gentle voice they had learned at Sunset Manor, letting each captain's gratitude ring softly in the lamp room, while Cordelia's fingers traced familiar paths across her collection of sea glass. "Captain Morrison writes from Halifax," River would say, unfolding paper that crackled with age. "He says the storm of '93 would have taken his whole crew, if not for your light cutting through the sleet." Cordelia's eyes would often clear during these readings, recognition flickering across her face as she remembered not just the storm, but the particular quality of that night's wind, the way the beam had seemed to reach further than usual, as if the light itself understood the urgency of its mission. When words tangled themselves in Cordelia's mouth, or familiar tasks felt suddenly foreign, River learned to offer their humming as a musical bridge between confusion and clarity. The melody that emerged during these moments carried something of the lighthouse beam's own rhythm, patient, constant, reassuring in its very predictability. River wasn't trying to bring Cordelia back to some previous version of herself, but rather to accompany wherever version was present, creating a space where drift felt less like losing and more like a different kind of navigation. As autumn deepened and evening came earlier each day, River began staying through the lighting ceremony, learning to tend the beacon not as replacement, but as companion. Cordelia's hands still remembered the sequence, even when her mind wandered, and together they would polish the lens and check the oil. River's humming weaving through the familiar ritual like a gentle current that helped carry them both toward the moment when flame would bloom and a faithful beam would begin its nightly rounds. The townspeople noticed the change, without needing explanation, the way communities always sense when care is being passed from one generation to the next. They would see two figures moving together around the lighthouse gallery at dusk. River's younger hands guided by Cordelia's accumulated wisdom, learning not just the mechanics of lighthouse keeping, but the deeper art of maintaining hope for travelers. They would never meet. On evenings when fog pressed close and Cordelia's memories drifted like ships beyond the reach of any beacon, River would sit beside her and read the letters that spoke of safe passages and grateful hearts, their voice creating a lighthouse of its own, a steady point of warmth in whatever weather was moving through the keeper's mind. The beam swept its patient arc across the water, and River understood that they were witnessing something sacred, not an ending but a transformation, the way light itself changes form but never truly disappears. The winter that followed brought changes that seemed to whisper through the town like wind through tall grass, subtle shifts that residents felt more than saw, as if the very air had learned something new about patience. River noticed it first, during their morning walks to the sandwich shop, when familiar sounds, delivery trucks downshifting, dogs announcing the dawn, the harbor bell marking the fishing boat's departure, seemed to have found a gentler frequency, each noise settling into harmony rather than competing for attention. These weren't the dramatic transformations that announced themselves with fanfare, but the kind of quiet evolution that accumulates like morning dew, barely visible, until the whole world seems to shimmer with something new. River moved between the lighthouse, where Cordelia drifted through her duties with peaceful acceptance of her mind's gentle wandering, and the sandwich shop, where conversations had begun taking on a different quality, deeper and more patient, as if people were remembering how to listen with their whole hearts. The changes revealed themselves in moments that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Lysis, the mail carrier whose retirement fears had once weighed heavy on his shoulders, began leaving small bouquets of wildflowers in the mailboxes of elderly residents, his official duties softening into acts of unexpected grace. The perpetually broken streetlight at the corner of Pelican and Harbor, which had resisted every repair attempt for years, simply began working again one Tuesday morning, its steady glow illuminating the path with newfound purpose. At the library, Miriam discovered books returning themselves, volumes that had been overdue for months appearing on her desk, with handwritten apology notes tucked between their pages, as if the stories themselves had grown homesick and found their way back. The washing machines at the laundromat stopped their violent shaking, settling into rhythms that sounded almost like contentment. Even the teenagers who gathered at the harbor after school found their restless energy transforming into genuine curiosity about the world beyond their familiar shores. It was during one of these contemplative evenings that River witnessed something that revealed the true scope of what was unfolding. The Hendricks brothers, whose property line dispute had festered for 15 years into a feud involving lawyers and deliberately placed fence posts, suddenly found themselves embracing in the middle of Harbor Street. River watched from a respectful distance as two men who hadn't spoken in over a decade stood with their arms around each other, tears streaming down weathered faces. "I can't even remember what we were so angry about," the younger brother said, his words floating on the salt breeze like a confession and a prayer. "All these years of carrying this weight, and for what?" The elder brother nodded, his voice thick with emotion, as he spoke about missed dinners and grandchildren who had grown up knowing their uncles only as distant figures in a family story that suddenly felt too heavy to carry. River understood then that they were witnessing the beginning of what would later be called the Great Softening, not destruction but a collective exhale, a gentle unraveling of the hard edges that had accumulated over generations. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a slow, tender blooming, like a flower unfurling its petals after a long winter. The very atmosphere seemed to have become conducive to healing, dissolving the sharp boundaries of old grievances and inviting hearts to remember their natural capacity for forgiveness. The transformation touched everything from human relationships to the way morning light fell across familiar streets. Arguments that once simmered for weeks over fishing territories or misplaced equipment now resolved themselves with unexpected embraces and shared cups of tea. The competitive edge that had always hummed beneath the harbor's surface softened into collaborative rhythms, fishermen helping each other mend nets without thought of advantage or loss. River sensed that their gift was somehow connected to these changes, not as a cause but as a participant in something much larger than any individual ability. Their humming, which had always been a balm for individual hearts, now felt like part of a vast chorus, the town itself learning to breathe with the same patient rhythm that had transformed their childhood. Walking home from the lighthouse each evening, River could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the community's emotional weather, as if the collective heart had found its natural tempo. The gentle storms that had once seemed unusual now revealed themselves as harbingers, preparing the land and its inhabitants for this profound softening. River's conversations with the ocean had been a prelude to this deeper dialogue between all living things, a remembering of an ancient understanding that existence was meant to flow with grace rather than grind with friction. As spring approached with its promises of renewal, River felt their role shifting once again. They were no longer just offering individual comfort, but somehow serving as a bridge between the town's old patterns of separation and something new that was trying to be born. The lighthouse beam, making its faithful nightly rounds, now seemed to illuminate not just the physical landscape, but something deeper, a community remembering how to hold its own heart with tenderness, preparing for whatever gentle revelation was approaching on the horizon. The days following the Great Softening's gentle arrival carried a new quality of expectation, as if the community had collectively inhaled and was now waiting to discover what would emerge on the exhale. River felt this shift most acutely during the quiet moments between serving sandwiches and tending to Cordelia, sensing that the individual threads of healing they had been weaving were ready to become part of a larger tapestry, one that could only be created through shared hands and voices. Luna noticed it too, arriving at the sandwich shop one afternoon with the particular brightness that comes from recognizing a need and knowing exactly how it might be met. "People are lingering," she said, settling into the chair by the window where afternoon light painted everything in shades of honey and hope. "After their appointments at the clinic, they don't want to leave. They sit in the waiting room talking about dreams they haven't mentioned in years, sharing stories about their grandparents' gardens. There's something trying to gather itself, River, and I think it needs our help. River understood immediately, the way understanding sometimes arrives complete and fully formed, like morning light suddenly revealing a landscape that had been there all along. The song library, with its comfortable benches and walls lined with preserved melodies, seemed to offer itself as the natural gathering place for whatever wanted to emerge from the community's softened heart. That evening, River moved through the converted train station with deliberate care, lighting candles in mason jars until the space glowed with the kind of warmth that invites confidences and shared silences. They set out simple offerings, a pot of soup that carried the comfort of home in its steam, bread that broke easily between gentle hands, tea that tasted of chamomile and distant meadows. On the old chalkboard where train schedules had once been posted, River wrote simply, "Tonight bring your voice or your quiet self. All ways of being here are welcome." The first to arrive was Elias, still wearing his mail carrier's jacket, though his route had ended hours earlier, carrying the particular dignity of someone who had spent decades connecting neighbors through carefully delivered words. Miriam followed with a basket of smooth stones she had collected from the harbor, each one chosen to represent a story she had been carrying alone. Gus appeared in the doorway with his hands scrubbed clean, but still bearing the honorable stains of honest work, a small book tucked against his chest like a treasured secret. Sage tuned their guitar by the window, where the lighthouse beam would occasionally sweep past, turning the glass into a river of moving light. Luna brought families from the clinic, a mother whose child was recovering from illness, an elderly man learning to navigate the world with failing eyesight, a young father whose hands shook with worry, but steadied when he held his sleeping daughter. River did not make speeches or set agendas. Instead, they moved through the space with the same patient attention they had learned from Cordelia, creating an atmosphere where hearts could safely emerge from their careful hiding places. When they hummed, it was not to lead but to offer a gentle current beneath whatever wanted to surface, a musical foundation that made vulnerability feel less like risk and more like coming home. The evening unfolded with the organic rhythm of genuine communion. Sage began with a simple call and response, their voice weaving through the candlelit space like an invitation to remember that music was humanity's first language. Miriam found herself reading a letter from her daughter, her voice growing stronger as the room breathed with her words. The young father discovered that his worry transformed into something more manageable when shared, with others who understood the fierce tenderness of loving someone whose safety you cannot guarantee, even old Mr. Finch. The town's most determined curmudgeon appeared in the doorway with his arms crossed and his perpetual frown firmly in place. River offered him tea without comment, and something in that simple gesture seemed to crack the armor he had been wearing for decades. By evening's end, he was humming along with Sage's guitar, a forgotten melody from his own childhood, rising unbidden to his lips like a prayer he had thought lost forever. As the weeks passed, these Thursday gatherings became woven into the town's rhythm as naturally as tides or seasons. River watched their role transform from individual comforter to community facilitator, helping others discover their own capacity for offering and receiving care. The lighthouse beam, making its faithful rounds through the song library's windows, seemed to bless this work of bringing hearts together in service of something larger than any single story or sorrow. People began arriving with offerings that reflected their particular gifts. Luna shared stories of resilience witnessed daily at the clinic, while Gus read aloud from books that had taught him new words for old feelings. Children fell asleep against their parents' shoulders, and the lighthouse beam swept gently across their dreams, carrying the promise that some lights never stop burning, some songs never truly end, and some communities remember how to hold their own hearts with the tenderness they deserve. The Thursday gatherings had woven themselves so naturally into the town's rhythm that River could feel the community's collective heartbeat in the way neighbors arrived with offerings of soup and stories, their voices blending into harmonies that seemed to rise from the song library's weathered walls like incense. It was during one such evening, as autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and rust, that River sensed something shifting in the larger symphony of their world, a subtle change that called their attention toward the lighthouse with new urgency. Cordelia had been drifting more frequently in recent weeks, her mind like morning mist that sometimes cleared to reveal familiar landmarks and sometimes thickened into gentle confusion. Yet even in her deepest reveries, her hands still remembered the precise movements for tending the great lens, her weathered fingers tracing paths across surfaces they had polished for decades. River spent most evenings at the lighthouse now, their presence a steady anchor, while Cordelia navigated waters that grew more mysterious with each passing day. The change announced itself on a night when stars appeared with unusual brightness, as if the sky itself wanted to bear witness to something sacred. River found Cordelia sitting in her favorite chair by the lamproom window, wrapped in maize quilt, her pale blue eyes reflecting the lighthouse beam with serene acceptance. The cedar chest lay open beside her, its contents sorted into careful piles, letters from grateful captains, photographs of sunsets that had painted the lamproom in impossible colors, pieces of sea glass worn smooth by patient tides. "The light reaches so far tonight," Cordelia whispered, her voice thin but clear as morning air. "All the way to the very edge of forever." River settled beside her and began to hum the old sea chanty she had taught them years ago, a melody about ships finding their way home through long, dark nights. Cordelia's breathing grew lighter as the beam swept through the window, illuminating her face with ethereal gentleness. Word moved through the town without announcement, traveling by the same mysterious channels that had carried news of the great softening. Neighbors began appearing on the lighthouse hill as evening deepened, not with urgency, but with the patient reverence of those who understand that some moments deserve proper witness. Luna carried candles that flickered like tiny prayers. Sage brought the guitar whose wood had absorbed decades of gentle songs. Even Mr. Finch arrived with a small wooden carving tucked against his chest, a miniature lighthouse he had crafted in secret. River continued humming as the community gathered outside, their voices joining in harmonies that seemed to travel with the lighthouse beam itself, reaching toward ships they could not see and hearts they would never know. Cordelia's eyes found River's in the soft darkness, and something passed between them that felt like gratitude and blessing combined, the peaceful transfer of responsibility from one generation to the next. When Cordelia's final breath arrived, it came like the most natural of tides, not struggle but completion, the gentle conclusion of a circle she had walked faithfully for decades. River felt the release as warmth leaving the hand in theirs, not disappearing but spreading, becoming part of the lighthouse beam that continued its patient rotation through the night. The great lens seemed to sing a note so pure that everyone on the hill felt their hearts lift in quiet recognition of something beautiful passing into light. Morning brought the particular clarity that follows profound transitions. The community moved with unhurried grace, bringing casseroles and memories, transforming grief into celebration through the simple act of sharing stories that honored Cordelia's decades of faithful service. The gathering that afternoon felt less like farewell and more like recognition, neighbors speaking of fog-bound nights when her light had guided them home, storms weathered and safe passages ensured. As evening approached, each person lit a small lantern they had brought, and River watched from the lighthouse gallery as dozens of gentle flames dotted the hillside like earthbound stars. Sage's guitar offered melodies that wove through the salt air, while voices joined in songs Cordelia had loved, creating a chorus that seemed to bridge the space between memory and hope. River climbed the spiral stairs alone as darkness gathered, carrying the weight of inheritance not as burden, but as privilege. They lit the great beacon with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from recognition of the sacred trust being passed forward. The beam began its nightly rotation, sweeping across waters that held decades of Cordelia's attention and care, and River understood that they were continuing something much larger than any individual life, an ancient conversation between light and darkness, between those who serve and those who need guidance through whatever storms the night might bring. The lighthouse beam reached across the harbor toward the Song Library's warm windows, a blessing both the work of preservation and the ongoing task of helping hearts find their way safely home. The weeks following Cordelia's peaceful transition brought River into the rhythm of inheritance, not as something received, but as something continuously created through the daily choice to tend whatever light was trying to shine through the world. Each morning, as dawn touched the great lens, River would trace the familiar paths their mentor's weathered hands had known, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like a comfortable quilt across their shoulders. The lighthouse keeper's quarters, once a solitary sanctuary, began transforming under River's gentle attention. A kettle sang its patient song on the small stove, offering steam to visitors who climbed the spiral stairs carrying burdens too heavy for individual shoulders. The cedar chest that had held Cordelia's letters now welcomed new treasures, smooth stones from children who found comfort in the beam's nightly sweep, pressed flowers from elderly neighbors who made the pilgrimage to watch sunsets, handwritten notes from travelers seeking more than just a view of the harbor. River discovered that the lighthouse had become more than a beacon for ships. It served as sanctuary for anyone feeling lost in the gentle transformation that continued to unfold across their coastal town. The comfortable chair by the lamproom window invited the kind of conversations that happened when people felt safely held by something ancient and enduring, while the steady rotation of the beam created a meditative rhythm that helped hearts settle into their natural pace. It was during one such quiet afternoon that Luna appeared at the lighthouse door, her face glowing with new motherhood and the particular radiance of someone who had finally found their way home. "River," she said, settling into the chair where Cordelia had spent her final evening, "I'd like you to meet Melody." The baby in her arms seemed to carry the same serene attention River remembered from their own earliest days. Eyes wide and dark as tide pools, already listening to something beyond the visible world. As Luna nursed her daughter in the lighthouse's gentle atmosphere, she spoke of changes that had drawn her back from the city hospital where she'd been working. Patients started arriving with different needs, she explained, watching afternoon light paint the lamp room in shades of honey. Less urgent physical ailments, and more requests for someone to simply listen, while they sorted through whatever the great softening had brought to the surface. "They need what you've always offered, that gift of making space for whatever needs to be held." River understood that Luna was describing something they had witnessed throughout the town, the way collective healing had revealed deeper layers of need that couldn't be addressed through individual comfort alone. The Thursday gatherings at the Song Library had shown how powerful it could be when people discovered their own capacity for offering care. But there was still something missing, some element that would help the transformation become truly sustainable. The answer revealed itself through Melody, who seemed to possess the same intuitive sensitivity that had marked River's childhood. Even at a few weeks old, she would grow quiet and attentive during moments when visitors needed extra comfort, her tiny presence somehow adding to the healing atmosphere River was learning to create. Other children in Luna's clinic would gravitate toward Melody's calm energy, while adults found their voices softening when speaking near her sleeping form. "She's going to need guidance," River said one evening as they watched the lighthouse beams sweep across the harbor. "Someone who understands that sensitivity is a gift meant for service, not something to be managed or hidden away." Luna nodded, her own memories of childhood fears and the comfort River had offered making her acutely aware of what her daughter might face. Over the following months, River began documenting not just the practical aspects of lighthouse keeping, but the deeper wisdom they had accumulated through years of serving as a bridge between individual pain and collective healing. They wrote letters to future keepers, recording maintenance schedules alongside insights about creating sanctuary, about helping lost things remember their way home. The lighthouse became a training ground for a different kind of service, with Luna bringing Melody for regular visits, where the infant could absorb the rhythms of patient attention and unconditional presence. River would hum while polishing the great lens, teaching through example how daily tasks could become acts of meditation when approached with proper reverence. As evening settled over the harbor and the lighthouse beam began its faithful rotation, River felt the satisfaction that comes from witnessing seeds planted long ago beginning to bloom. Melody slept peacefully in Luna's arms, her breathing creating the same gentle rhythm that had marked River's own arrival in the world, while the beam swept across waters that held decades of careful tending and the promise of generations yet to come, each rotation carrying the town's collective heart safely through whatever darkness the night might bring. The years that followed moved like gentle tides, each season bringing its own rhythm of arrival and departure, while the lighthouse beam continued its patient rotation through nights that held both familiar sorrows and unexpected joys. River watched from the lamp room as Melody grew from infant into child, her sensitivity blossoming not as burden, but as natural gift. The way morning light gradually reveals a landscape that was always there, but needed time to become visible. At 7, Melody would climb the spiral stairs with the same unhurried attention River remembered from their own childhood visits with Cordelia, carrying small offerings that spoke of deep observation, a feather from a gull that had seemed particularly lonely, a piece of sea glass worn smooth by patient tides, a drawing of the lighthouse beam reaching all the way to the moon. River recognized in these gestures the same instinctive understanding that some things in the world needed tending. Some lights required faithful keepers. The town had settled into its transformed rhythm, the great softening having become as natural as breathing, woven into daily life through countless small acts of attention and care. The Thursday gatherings at the Song Library had evolved into something approaching sacred ritual, with neighbors bringing not just their voices, but their children, who learned by example that community was created through the simple choice to show up for each other's hearts. Sage's collection had multiplied like careful constellations on labeled shelves, each recording a star with a name: Mrs. Chen's River Song, Captain Murphy's Chanty, work melodies that once kept honest rhythm, island lullabies carried on careful voices. Schoolchildren came with clipboards and left with phrases they hummed while skipping rope. The Song Library's walls held more than preserved music. They contained the living record of a community learning to hold its own heart with tenderness. At the sandwich shop, the chalkboard menu stayed simple because no one wanted to change the handwriting River had been using for years. Letters with small, gentle curves that made even the word pickles feel like a kindness. The notes tucked into wax paper now often included lines from the town's collected songs, small poetic phrases that offered solace and connection. Elias, now retired, started a letter circle in the corner booth, where people wrote to those they hadn't called in years, tucking sandwiches beside envelopes like blessings for journeys letters take. Luna had established what she called the listening clinic, a space where people could bring ailments that had no clear medical solutions, the persistent ache of loneliness, the chronic fatigue of carrying old grudges, the inflammation that comes from holding too much worry. She worked alongside River to create healing environments where bodies could remember their natural capacity for wellness when supported by genuine attention and care. River's role had expanded beyond lighthouse keeping to something approaching elder wisdom, despite their years still being measured in decades rather than generations. Visitors arrived from neighboring towns, drawn by stories of a place where arguments resolved themselves with embraces, where broken things somehow found their way to wholeness. River would welcome them to the lighthouse with tea and patience, sharing not techniques but presence, helping them understand that transformation couldn't be taught but only lived. Their hair had begun to silver like moonlight on water, and their humming had deepened into something that felt less like personal gift and more like participation in an ancient conversation between earth and sky and human heart. River's connection to their gift had evolved from individual comfort to something approaching universal frequency, a gentle current that connected all living things. Melody, meanwhile, collected small responsibilities the way other children collected stones. She learned who needed a blanket during Thursday gatherings without being told. She started wiping tables at the sandwich shop in patient circles that looked suspiciously like polishing the lens. Where River's gift had always been about offering comfort through presence, Melody seemed naturally drawn to the spaces between, helping people navigate transitions, offering companionship to those crossing from one phase of life to another. As autumn settled over the harbor, with its familiar palette of amber and rust, River began the gentle work of preparation, not for departure but for transformation. They wrote letters to future lighthouse keepers, recorded the songs that had emerged during their years of service, established rituals that would continue long after their individual voice had joined the larger chorus of those who had served the light. The lighthouse beam swept across waters that held decades of faithful attention, blessing fishing boats returning home, and blessing hearts that had learned to carry their own illumination into whatever darkness might come. River felt the deep satisfaction of seeds planted long ago now bearing fruit in ways they could never have imagined, the town itself having become a beacon for communities seeking their own path toward collective healing. understanding that their life had been one long lullaby sung in service of helping the world remember its own capacity for peace. The wisdom of worn paths revealed itself most clearly in winter's gentle embrace, when River's hair had silvered like moonlight on still water, and their movements carried the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that some moments deserved to be savored rather than hurried. The years had not diminished their gift but deepened it, transforming their humming into something that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself, a constant undertone that connected all living things in their small coastal town. River approached the work of legacy with the same patient attention they had brought to every other calling in their life. The lighthouse keeper's quarters became a careful archive of accumulated wisdom, with small labels written in their gentle hand marking supplies and insights alike. On shelves near the great lens, they arranged thin sea-blue journals filled with observations that read less like instruction and more like love letters to future keepers. "Keep water for the hydrangeas on the stairs in summer," one entry read. "Sing to the glass even when it looks clean. The light hears love through your hands." Working alongside Sage, River spent quiet afternoons creating recordings that captured not just melodies, but the stories that gave each song its particular healing power. These weren't polished performances, but honest expressions of comfort, designed to be shared in moments when hearts needed reminding of their own capacity for peace. Sage's portable recorder became a sacred tool, preserving the ambient sounds of their transformed community. The gentle conversations at Thursday gatherings, the soft laughter of children in the memory garden, the whispered prayers of those finding solace in the lighthouse beam. Melody, now blossoming into adolescence with the same intuitive sensitivity that had marked River's own youth, had begun creating her own contributions to the town's ongoing transformation. Behind the song library, she established what she called the memory garden, a space where people could plant flowers in honor of those who had passed, creating living monuments that bloomed with seasonal beauty, rather than standing as static memorials. River watched with quiet pride as Melody moved through the garden with unhurried grace, teaching elderly visitors how to tend memorial plantings while listening to stories about the people being honored. The lighthouse had become more than a beacon for ships. It served as sanctuary for visitors from neighboring communities who arrived seeking to understand how transformation had taken root so completely in their small town. River welcomed them with the same patient attention they had learned from Cordelia, sharing not techniques but presence, helping them understand that healing couldn't be exported like a product, but only cultivated through daily choices to treat each encounter as an opportunity for grace. River began establishing rituals that would outlast any individual life. The weekly gathering at the song library, the daily offering of smooth stones at the lighthouse base, the quiet moments of shared tea that created space for hearts to open safely. These weren't formal ceremonies, but gentle traditions that carried the weight of accumulated love, like sea glass worn smooth by countless tides, each transformation revealing new beauty. As their body prepared for its own eventual transition, River approached the prospect with the same grace they had brought to helping others navigate their endings. There was no fear, only deep gratitude for the opportunity to have served as bridge between individual pain and collective healing. They spent longer periods simply sitting by the lamproom window as the beam swept across waters that held decades of faithful attention, feeling their connection to Cordelia, to all the hearts they had helped find peace. The knowledge that Melody was growing into her own understanding of this sacred service brought profound comfort. River watched her move with the same quiet reverence, her hands already learning the subtle language of comfort, her heart naturally attuned to where gentle attention was most needed. In one of the blue journals, River wrote, "Legacy isn't about monuments, but about the gentle, persistent ways of being that outlast any individual life. Be faithful to the small and the vast will take care of itself." River understood now, with the clarity that comes only from a long journey of service, that their entire existence had been one continuous lullaby sung to help the world remember how to rest more peacefully. Every hum, every gentle presence offered in moments of need, had been verses in this vast unfolding song that connected earth and sky and human heart. As evening settled over the harbor and River climbed the familiar spiral stairs to light the beacon, they carried with them the accumulated weight of decades spent in service to something that had begun as individual gift and evolved into collective transformation. The lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation, sweeping across the song library's warm windows, across the memory garden where flowers held stories in their roots, across homes where neighbors had learned to hold each other's hearts with deserved tenderness, carrying forward the eternal promise that love, like light, never truly disappears but only finds new forms, new voices, new hands to tend the flame that guides all lost things safely home. The evening that would complete River's circle arrived with the same patient gentleness that had marked their birth. When clocks throughout the town seemed to remember the softer rhythm they had learned in Maple's kitchen so many decades ago. Each tick fell like a whispered blessing, marking time not with urgency, but with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred transitions. River felt it in their bones, this approaching completion, not as ending, but as the natural conclusion of a melody that had been playing since their first breath. The lighthouse lamp room glowed with familiar warmth as evening settled over their transformed coastal town. River sat wrapped in May's quilt, the one that still carried faint traces of lavender, and all the lullabies stitched into its worn fabric. Their hair, now silver as moonlight on still water, caught the gentle radiance of the great lens, while their breathing had deepened into the same patient rhythm that had once calmed crying babies and restless storms. Melody sat beside them, her presence steady and sure, hands that had learned to tend the memory garden now offering the wordless comfort River had taught through decades of example. At 25, she carried herself with the same unhurried grace, understanding that some moments required nothing more than quiet witness to the profound beauty of a life reaching its tender completion. Through the lamp-room windows, the view revealed the accumulated transformation spread below like a living testament to what became possible when communities remembered how to hold their own hearts with tenderness. The song library's warm glow welcomed Thursday evening voices, blending into harmonies that rose through salt air like gentle prayers. The harbor held fishing boats returning not just with the day's catch, but with the satisfaction of work done in harmony rather than competition. "Do you remember," River whispered, voice thin but clear as morning air, "the first time you hummed to that old washing machine?" Melody smiled, tears gathering like dewdrops. "May said you made it sound almost happy, like it had finally found its proper song." River nodded, feeling the vast circle of their life, completing itself, from that small miracle in a grandmother's kitchen to this moment when their voice was preparing to join something infinitely larger. The lighthouse beam swept, its faithful arc across familiar waters, and River began to hum, starting as barely a whisper, then deepening into something that seemed to contain all the comfort ever offered, all the peace ever found in quiet corners of the world. It was not a song of sorrow, but of profound gratitude, for morning light learning to breathe gently, for ocean waves that had taught them to listen, for Cordelia's patient wisdom, for Luna's enduring friendship, for every single heart whose journey they had been privileged to companion with their gentle presence. Melody felt the moment of transition as warmth spreading through the room. Not departure, but expansion. River's voice merging with the ancient chorus of wind and wave, becoming part of the eternal hum that helps the universe remember how to be tender with itself. The great lens seemed to sing a note so pure that everyone in town felt their hearts lift in quiet recognition of something beautiful passing into light. River's final breath arrived like the most natural of tides, not struggle but completion, a gentle settling into the vast symphony they had always served. Their humming didn't fade but transformed, becoming part of the lighthouse beam's faithful rotation, part of the patient wind that carried comfort across the harbor, part of the ongoing lullaby that would continue long after individual voices had joined the larger chorus. As dawn painted the horizon in shades of rose and gold, Melody understood she was now keeper, not just of the lighthouse but of the living tradition River had spent their life creating. The beam swept across waters that held decades of faithful attention, across the song library, where preserved melodies waited to comfort future hearts, across homes where neighbors continued practicing the gentle art of holding each other through whatever storms might come. The town awakened to the same transformed rhythm it had known for years, but now carrying something deeper, the understanding that River's gift had never belonged to one person alone, but had always been part of the eternal conversation between all living things. Children would still fall asleep more easily during gentle storms. Elderly residents would still find their arthritis less troublesome on misty mornings, and hearts would continue discovering their capacity for peace in the quiet spaces River had helped create. Somewhere in the patient turning of the lighthouse beam, in the soft conversations at Thursday gatherings, in the gentle notes tucked into sandwich wrappers, River's lullaby continues, not ended but endless, not lost but found in every voice that chooses kindness, every hand that offers comfort. Every heart that remembers the world is meant to be held with tenderness. Thanks for spending this time with us tonight, friend. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay. And tomorrow will bring its own gentle possibilities for love.